There is no institution more heavily protected by sentimental propaganda than the biological family. From the earliest stages of cognitive development, the individual is systematically indoctrinated with the myth of the sacred bond, the absolute decree that sharing genetic material creates an unbreakable, unconditional moral contract. Society brands filial piety as the ultimate virtue, dictating that regardless of the trauma, the manipulation, or the psychological rot inflicted within the domestic walls, one must remain loyal to the blood. But if one strips away the layers of cultural conditioning and observes the dynamic with cold, clinical clarity, a devastating truth emerges. The family is not a sanctuary of souls. It is a biological accident wrapped in social coercion. Arthur Schopenhauer recognized that nature uses the domestic unit as a functional cage to ensure the preservation and containment of the species. The individual does not choose their parents, their siblings, or their ancestral heritage. They are violently dropped into a specific genetic lottery by the blind, indifferent mechanics of the will to live. To insist that a person owes their lifelong sanity, intellectual freedom, and psychological peace to a group of strangers simply because their chromosomes, aligned in a moment of physical impulse, is a monumental logical fallacy. Today, we dismantle the myth of moral inheritance, exposing how existential guilt is weaponized by the dysfunctional herd to keep the sovereign mind tethered to a sinking ship. The individual who operates under the delusion that blood guarantees benevolence is routinely destroyed from within. They tolerate narcissistic abuse, emotional cannibalism, and constant boundary violations from relatives, operating under the naive hope that family will eventually change. This hope is the ultimate engine of misery. It forces the individual to repeatedly offer their vulnerabilities to the very people who engineered their deepest psychological scars. The expectation of parental or familiar validation is the final chain that must be broken. True sovereignty does not begin when one is accepted by the tribe. It begins when the mind realizes that the tribe has no inherent right to ownership over the individual. To fully dissolve the guilt of detachment, the mind must analyze the true nature of biological proximity. Schopenhauer observed that human relations are governed by the friction of egos, and the family dynamic is the concentrated epicenter of this friction. Two individuals do not become intellectually compatible, morally aligned, or emotionally safe for one another simply because they share a lineage. In any other arena of life, if a person encountered an individual who was manipulative, envious, or intellectually stagnant, they would naturally walk away. Yet within the family structure, society demands that the individual embrace the toxic agent, calling it unconditional love. This demand is an absurdity. A family unit is a collection of random individuals forced into a geographic and economic corral by circumstance. Parents frequently project their unfulfilled ambitions, their unhealed traumas, and their deep-seated frustrations onto their children, viewing them not as sovereign minds, but as property extensions of their own fragile egos. When the child grows, develops a critical intellect, and refuses to participate in the domestic theater of delusions, the family interprets this independence as treason. The conflict is inevitable, because the system values compliance over truth. The universe does not select your family based on a spiritual blueprint. It operates through blind, organic necessity. The parent is merely a bridge used by nature to produce another unit of existence. And once that unit is formed, the biological debt is fully settled. The widespread belief that a child owes an unpayable debt of gratitude for the mere act of being fed and sheltered is a strategic manipulation. Providing for the offspring is the biological cost of the parent's own desire. It is a duty mandated by law and instinct, not a favor that buys a lifetime of psychological submission from the child. The sovereign individual recognizes that respect and connection must be earned through character, not claimed through a birth certificate. Let us examine the anatomy of the specific guilt that paralyzes the modern individual. The fear of being labeled cold, ungrateful, or a bad son. This guilt is not a natural law. It is a highly engineered social tool. Society requires the myth of family cohesion because the domestic unit is the primary mechanism of state stability and economic consumption. If individuals felt entirely free to abandon dysfunctional families without social penalty, the structural illusions of the herd would fracture. Therefore, the crowd consensus acts as an enforcement squad, weaponizing shame against anyone who dares to walk away from a toxic household. The narcissistic family structure works like a miniature dictatorship. It operates through unspoken contracts, favoritism, and systemic gaslighting. If an individual attempts to point out the dysfunction, the collective instantly recalibrates to defend the lie. The truth teller is branded as the problem, the black sheep, the instigator of disharmony. The system does not want healing. It wants equilibrium. It requires the individual to suppress their own intelligence and absorb the toxic energy of the group to keep the fragile peace intact. To remain in such an environment as to agree to a slow, methodical suicide of the spirit. This architecture of guilt is amplified by the myth of the elder's infallibility. The individual is told to respect their elders regardless of their conduct, under the assumption that age equates to wisdom. But Schopenhauer was clear: age merely brings decay and the crystallization of biases. A foolish, malicious youth simply becomes an old, malicious tyrant. Time does not purify an abusive character, it merely hardens it. The sovereign mind refuses to bow to gray hair when it is accompanied by a dark heart. Honor is due only to those who possess integrity, and if a parent possesses none, the child is under no moral obligation to manufacture it out of thin air. There is an immense, unpayable price attached to maintaining a false peace with a toxic lineage. The individual who chooses compliance over estrangement undergoes a daily castration of their own boundaries. They attend holiday gatherings that feel like trials, participate in conversations filled with masked insults, and allow their achievements to be minimized by parientes who harbor hidden envy. This endurance is not strength, it is the submissive behavior of a captive animal. The psychological toll of this compromise manifests as chronic anxiety, self-doubt, and permanent exhaustion. The individual spends days preparing for an interaction and weeks recovering from the aftermath. They are voluntarily poisoning their own well, drinking the toxic waste of their family's unresolved neuroses just to satisfy a societal expectation. The system watches this slow destruction and calls it decency. But for the individual who seeks sovereignty, decency cannot be bought at the expense of sanity. When the breaking point finally arrives, when the individual realizes that 40 years of compliance have bought them exactly zero respect, the separation is often chaotic. The family responds not with self-reflection, but with a massive campaign of smear tactics. They contact mutual associates, playing the victim, whispering that the individual has become cold, arrogant, or crazy. This is the final test of the sovereign armor. If the individual still craves their approval, they will crawl back into the cage. But if the illusion has truly been shattered, the smear campaign is recognized for what it actually is: a white flag from a defeated system that has lost its power to coerce. The act of cutting ties with a dysfunctional family is the ultimate declaration of psychological independence. It is the moment the individual stops being a biological product and becomes a sovereign mind. In the vocabulary of the herd, estrangement is viewed as a tragedy, a failure, an unnatural act. But in the architecture of strength, it is a clinical extraction, the necessary removal of a necrotic limb to save the rest of the organism. The immediate aftermath of this separation is characterized by a heavy, profound silence. The individual is suddenly outside the domestic noise, outside the historical narrative of their faults, and entirely alone in their own space. The masses mistake this silence for loneliness and panic, running back to their abusers just to hear a familiar voice. But the wise individual recognizes this silence as the clean, cold air of freedom. For the first time in their existence, their mind belongs entirely to themselves. You do not owe your life to the people who gave you birth. You did not sign a contract before entering the world. The only real obligation an intelligent being possesses is to truth and to the preservation of their own consciousness. If the primary source of your psychological pollution is the household you were raised in, the most moral act you can perform is to exile yourself from it. Let the dead bury their dead. Let the toxic dynamic consume itself without your energy to fuel it. Your absence is the only statement they will ever truly understand. When the biological illusion is completely discarded, the concept of connection undergoes a radical, elegant transformation. The individual no longer looks for relationships based on genetic accidents, They look for relationships based on intellectual alignment, shared silence, and mutual respect. They realize that true brotherhood is not forged in the womb, but in the fire of shared values. This is the transition from the accidental family to the chosen foundation. The sovereign mind does not need a large tribe, a circle of 2 or 3 independent minds, or even a life of absolute. Self-sufficient solitude is vastly superior to a stadium full of relatives who require you to wear a mask. The value of a connection is determined by its transparency, not by its pedigree. If a stranger understands your silence better than your mother understands your words, the stranger is your true kin. Stand firm in the void of your autonomy. Do not look back at the burning house of your childhood, hoping to salvage a scrap of affection that was never there. Accept that some doors must be locked from the outside and the key thrown into the dark. The sovereign individual operates as a self-contained empire. They are their own ancestor, their own defender, and their own ultimate judge. The world can no longer use the weapon of family guilt against a person who has recognized that blood is simply water, and that the only sacred thing in existence is a mind that refuses to be broken. The domestic theater is empty. The ancestral chains have turned to dust. The contract of genetic servitude was a forgery designed by a fearful society to keep the independent spirit from escaping the corral. Let the masses continue to suffer through their miserable family reunions, pretending they care about people they secretly despise. You have seen through the curtain. There is no moral inheritance. There is no debt to the past. There is only the present moment and the absolute freedom of the mind that has chosen its own cold, clean sanctuary over a warm, toxic cage. The shadow does not carry the weight of the lineage. It simply obliterates it with the truth. Welcome to the final demolition of your biological illusions. Welcome to your own independent kingdom. If you have broken the genetic shackles, leave your mark in the comments. Subscribe to defend your sovereignty in the shadow.